Howdy there, Isaac here. Today we'll be continuing the story of Izuku Midoriya with Earthbending, and now one for all, I suppose. The last part was where some more interesting changes formed, with two new villains escaping USJ, Izuku getting a quirk boost, and then we started the school sports festival. With all the previous changes, will the sports festival go down like in canon, or will it too change? Let's find out this time on What If Izuku at Earthbending? The story starts now. The obstacle race would be an absolute piece of cake for Izuku. The students would run into the mechanical menaces, which would quickly be dealt with by Shoto and Izuku. Shoto would freeze the bots, with Izuku using a pillar to stab through one of them. The two would look at each other, Shoto showing a slight grimace as Izuku was keeping up with him. Midoriya was actually getting kinda pumped since Todoroki was both strong and had an elemental quirk just like him. He wondered which quirk was stronger, ice or earth. Suddenly, a large explosion rang out and Izuku looked back to see an enraged Bakugo flying towards the duo. Unlike in the anime, Bakugo completely busted up the bot, blowing apart its head. The blast hurt his hand a bit, but it wasn't as big as some of his previous ones, so he'd be fine. The second obstacle would be a bit harder, but Izuku's got this. He'd raise up a long earth column and allow it to fall forward, using it like a giant bridge. Even though Izuku had used pretty large columns, his fingers were only a little dry, not even stone yet. One for all really was amazing. Even though Izuku got around this much faster than in canon, Todoroki and Bakugo would still get ahead of him. The Earthbender was watching as the two rocketed forward. Todoroki was struggling with walking around the landmines, with Bakugo about to catch up via flying. Izuku had to think of something quick. He couldn't just run through the field, even if he could sort of sense where the mines were. Just then, Izuku would get an idea, before putting his hands flat on the ground. A few people would catch up to him, but that would be okay if this idea worked. The ground around him would begin to shift as mines were brought towards him. Izuku wondered if this could be used in combat, possibly to move people away or towards him. And before I get an angry comment, yes, this is an ability Earthbenders have. It's called Ground Shift, which is the name Izuku gives this move. Once Izuku figured he had enough mines, he'd stand on top of a piece of rock and use it to slam into the mines, setting them off. Izuku would fly forward, just barely getting in front of the other two opponents. He would then fall onto the ground and use a rock pillar to propel himself forward. Todoroki would run faster, with Bakugo flying as fast as he could to catch up to Izuku. Todoroki would be left behind, unable to keep up with the other two, who would quickly reach a stadium. Who won? Well, Izuku was slower, but had a slight head start, so Bakugo was able to catch up to him, but couldn't overtake him in time. So, it would be a tie for first place. How would they settle this tiebreaker? Well, with an arm wrestling match, of course. The rest of the participants would come in, most of them staying the same as in canon. Izuku and Bakugo's arm wrestling match would be legendary. I think Bakugo might be slightly stronger, but since you can just use your quirk, Izuku would just cover his hand with rock. An idea he might have gotten from seeing Kirishima, and end up beating Bakugo, who'd be completely pissed. Bakugo would stand up and stare down Izuku. I can't wait for a rematch in the finals, Deku. You better not lose to any of those small fry, especially not that half-and-half bastard. Izuku would go to speak, but Bakugo was already walking off. Izuku did kinda want to fight him again, since all their previous battles all had other secondary goals. But here, in the tournament, there was no clear goal other than beat the other person with your quirk. Or at least that was the fundamental requirement. The next event would be announced, with it of course being the cavalry battle. Every person who placed has a set amount of points, and that'd be represented with a headband. This, of course, meaning Izuku, who was first place, is worth the most points, effectively putting a target on his back. Everyone looked to Izuku, their eyes predatory. Midoriya gulped, but he was prepared for this. He had been working on a technique, one which was even more advanced than ground shift. This was one that he had thought up shortly after the villain attack. Everyone would end up trying to form teams, with most of them being the same as in canon, only with minor differences, if anything. Izuku would still have a tough time finding teammates, though Ochako would still team up with him, and like in canon, Ida would still reject him, since he wanted to win for once. Maybe if Ida wasn't such a piece of poop, he'd win sometimes. Anyways, Izuku would be left with the misfits of Class 1A, like in canon. Midoriya's team would end up being composed of Ochako, Mei, and Tokoyami. Together, they try to defend his points and their spot at first place. There is one vital change here though. Tokoyami and Izuku would switch places, with Izuku being a horse, whilst Tokoyami the rider. Why? Simple. This battle would be one of defense. Izuku would serve best with his defensive walls, while Tokoyami could use his height advantage and quirk maneuverability for both attack and defense. Izuku would create the castle walls, while Tokoyami would defend them. Once the event officially started, Izuku would slam his bare feet on the ground, instantly creating a series of walls all around his team. However, most of the students were prepared for that, including ones from 1B. Izuku's rock walls began to soften, as well as the ground underneath them. The soft earth was confusing for him. Rock was solid and could be cut into shapes easily, unlike water or even mud. Bending the mud would be too difficult, so running was the easier alternative. Izuku would tell Tokoyami to activate his jetpack, which he would do promptly, the team flying up into the air and landing away from their enemies. Tetsu and Mineta's team would converge on Izuku's, though neither would be much of a challenge due to Izuku's earth walls. Shoji isn't breaking through that rock, and that mud guy didn't use his quirk in the anime a second time, so I'm guessing he can't use it twice in a row in quick succession. Izuku wouldn't want to limit their options too much, but defense was important, so he'd create a version of his earth shelter without a roof. He would create a large cube-like room with enough space to run around in. This would give them enough time to run if need be, or to fly away since the room had no roof. Suddenly, a large column of ice would pierce Izuku's walls, only to melt before revealing Todoroki's team. Then, a large explosion from behind would draw Izuku's gaze onto Bakugo's team, who still had their points, unlike in canon. Izuku didn't like this. If he ran either way, they'd be caught. Running into the air could also be dangerous, with Bakugo's flying ability, and the possibility of Todoroki's ice. Izuku would tell Tokoyami to use the jetpack, only to see an ice wall cover the top of the room. Todoroki had anticipated them escaping into the air, with Bakugo already flying towards them. Izuku raised up 2 earth walls before using Earth Shift to skirt them to the side. Everyone was wondering just what the hell this would accomplish, but Izuku just told them to keep running between the walls towards the side of the room. Bakugo blasted through the thin wall, however, he was hit by a large ice column. Perfect, they had both fallen for it. That trick bought Izuku's team a few seconds. The Earthbender kicked up a piece of rock and launched it forward, breaking through the side wall of his rock room. His team ran out, making it to relative safety, since the other teams were all focused on everyone else. Izuku's team would keep running, only to run back into Mineta's team, who had lost their headband, which meant Shoji was now in full attack mode. The team rushed Izuku's, with Shoji grasping at Tokoyami's headband. Luckily, Dark Shadow was able to fend off the Octopus Man. Unfortunately, Mineta had thrown his balls onto the floor, trapping Izuku's team, with Tokoyami dodging Sue's tongue. And worse yet, Bakugo's team was already back in pursuit of them, though Monoma from Class 1B would sneak up and steal Bakugo's headband, only to get it stolen back because there's no way he'd be able to deal with a flying Bakugo. With 1 minute left in the cavalry battle, Todoroki would skirt around Bakugo's team and free Monetas before confronting Izuku. Todoroki would freeze an area around Izuku, making sure he couldn't run easily. Shoto would then use Kaminari's electricity to try and incapacitate Izuku's team, only for Dark Shadow to defend them. Todoroki would make Momo create another cannon, like she had against the bots, before then ordering the group to charge. Izuku would raise an earth wall only to see it get destroyed by a cannon shot, with Todoroki reaching forward, grasping at Tokoyami's headband. Izuku would use Earth Shift to make them move further away, only for Ida to use his Receiver Burst, a move that made him super duper pooper scooper fast. His team would race forward faster than almost anyone could react. Izuku had fought Bakugo, who was only a little slower than this, but Tokoyami hadn't, and so he was completely overtaken by Todoroki, who took their points. In this battle, Izuku's defense wasn't enough. He'd lost the 10 million points. Ida would grin at Izuku. "See, Midoriya? I told you I'd challenge you." "Ah, Ida, he never learns his lesson." Izuku would surround the opposing team with earth walls, and send up earth pillars all around them, acting like chains to restrict their movement. While Todoroki's team broke the thin earth pillars, Izuku's team charged them. Izuku was angry. He was ashamed that Todoroki had gotten the best of him. He knew he wasn't the best in the class, but openly losing like that, going from number 1 to 0, was frustrating. Not only that, he let everyone on his team down. He needed to get those points back. This frustration would be enough for him to unconsciously use One for All. This would push Todoroki into a corner, pressuring him enough to use his flames. Izuku's team would race forward, with Tokoyami stealing all of Todoroki's headbands aside from the 10 million. Both Izuku and Todoroki would end up being stunned. Izuku had used One for All. What the hell was he thinking? He wanted to win without the help of All Might's power. Todoroki was thinking the exact same thing, except far more resentful regarding his power. Bakugo would burst through the ice and rock, only for President Mike to say the event was now over. The teams would be in this order. Number 1 is Team Tokoyami, 2 is Bakugo, 3 is Todoroki, and 4th is Team Shinzo. So great, everyone is happy. Wait, no, everyone is upset for some reason. Izuku and Todoroki are disappointed they used their powers. Bakugo was angry and shouting that he didn't get first place again, and Shinzo's team were all confused as to what just happened. Now, on to the fun part, the tournament. Well, kinda. First we'd have a small break, where we'd see Izuku guzzling down a gallon of milk. For those who don't remember, this quirk is kinda, well, quirky. For some reason, milk helps Izuku's hands go back to normal, and since Izuku had used his quirk so much, his arms up to near his elbows were stone. We would still have Todoroki pulling Izuku aside to talk to him. Izuku isn't a nervous wreck like he was in the anime, so the two would just stare at each other, making for a very awkward situation. Todoroki was giving off a cold intimidation, while Izuku was just staring off and wondering how and why he had been pushed into using One for All. Todoroki would say that he was overpowered, and that he had felt something similar to All Might's power when Izuku had charged him. He'd then ask if Izuku was All Might's secret love child or something. Izuku would burst out laughing, saying that he wished that was the case. The Earthbender would then ask why Todoroki would think that. Shoto would respond, saying that the two seem to have some sort of relationship, but it seems like it's one Izuku can't talk about. Todoroki would then state that he's the son of the number 2 hero, Endeavor, and that if Izuku had something from the number 1, Todoroki had even more reason to beat Izuku. Meanwhile, All Might and Endeavor would still have their intense conversation, with Endeavor getting angry at All Might and pledging he'd make his son into a better hero than All Might ever was. And if you remember, this is where we learn Endeavor only thinks of his son as a trophy. Back in the hallway, we learn from Todoroki that his father was an abusive a-hole who only used his wife to create the perfect child. Shoto would explain that Endeavor was using him to fulfill his own desires. We would then get the backstory of Todoroki's mom going insane and burning his left side. Why is Todoroki telling Izuku all this? Who knows, but we need the exposition. This world, one of pure cruelty and trauma, was one Izuku wasn't entirely familiar with. He had always been sheltered and supported by his mother, and even the friends he'd made recently. Even during the villain incident, he had to rely on Sue and Mineta. Izuku was beginning to realize something in this moment. Todoroki was like him and Bakugo in some ways. They all wanted to be the number one, but they wanted to race there by themselves. As Todoroki began to walk off, Izuku would yell out. His hands clenched as he spoke these words. "I want to be the number one, and get there with only my quirk. But it isn't just about my quirk. It's about everyone else around me, supporting me and pushing me to be better. Todoroki, let's push each other to become better." Todoroki would look back at Izuku, his eyes wide. It'd been a long time since anyone had said anything along those sentiments. There was a slight sense of relief, but he wouldn't let himself feel that. He couldn't buy into Midoriya's speech. Todoroki would grimace and turn back around, walking away from Izuku. Back in the tournament, Izuku would pretty easily beat Shinzo, with all the other matches going just like in canon. This would lead to Izuku and Shoto preparing to fight each other. Izuku would chug another half-gallon of milk, his fingers nearly fully back to normal, while Todoroki would simply brood and think up a game plan. The two would walk into the arena once their match started. The two elemental benders would face each other down, both wanting to be number one, and both being pushed by the people behind them. Izuku knew Todoroki wouldn't use his fire, at least not without some encouragement. "Okay, Todoroki, let's see which is better, your ice or my rocks," Izuku said, slamming his foot onto the ground just as their match began. But that, fam, is where we'll be leaving it for now. Hope you guys enjoyed that video. If you did, I ask that you leave a like and maybe even subscribe to join our little league. Have a great day or night wherever you are. That's it for now. Bye bye.